Everyone, welcome to our first video of the 8th historical period of the APUSH curriculum, key concept 8.1.1, American Foreign Policy in the Cold War. So we'll be watching these ones in order this time, so no need to worry about all that stuff that was going on in period 7 with things being out of order. So what we're focusing on this time is specifically what American foreign policy was like during the Cold War. So the Cold War is lasting from the end of World War II all the way into the 1980s. So this is a lot of foreign policy, but there are some broad strokes and trends going on here that is really what you should be looking for in how we were interacting with the rest of the world. World War II is launching the United States to become the foremost world power, bigger than ever before, and that's going to change what we're doing at home and around the world. So let's see what that's like. So the first thing we need to really talk about is how World War II resolves and how it creates a new sort of post-war balance of power, and how both us and the Soviet Union now, instead of our ally, our main adversary, are going to try and use our world influence and power to get our way and to sort of build up that influence and power. Okay? Now, the things that kind of establishes what these policies are going to be like and really sets the stage for the Cold War are those Yalta and Potsdam conferences that we talked about during period 7. Now, the thing to really sort of take away from this is that the United Nations was created, it replaced the League of Nations, and we're entering into a time period where the world is increasingly globalized politically and economically. So that means that basically there's going to be more foreign sort of policy interactions and diplomacy, and we're going to see a lot of that through the United Nations as a body for meeting and resolving issues more peacefully than they could be resolved with war, as we had seen before. We're living in the nuclear age now, so a lot of these things, there's hopes to resolve things peacefully to avoid conflicts like World War II again. Alright, so a few institutions were set up after World War II to deal with this increasingly globalized world. So there was a meeting at a place called Bretton Woods in New England, and it creates the Bretton Woods system. Basically, this is a system that's used to this day to decide how sort of world investments will be managed. So institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund are created, and what these are going to do is they're going to decide how money will be lent out to developing countries and to countries in general to help them develop their industries and their country in general, really. You're dealing with, after World War II, that many countries were devastated by the war, and they don't have the capital, they don't have the investment to try and build up their infrastructure again. We're going to see that the World Bank and the IMF are going to fill that role, and they're going to help sort of decide that and keep the world economy stable. So this would be one of those things where conspiracy people are going to start talking about the Illuminati and all that business, because what you're really dealing with here, was that you're having a lot more cooperation with the elites around the world to help control politics and economics. Okay? There were practicalities of just trying to keep things stable, but it's going to increasingly put power in places like the United States, especially economically, because we were not as devastated in World War II as the rest of the world. Alright, the US dollar was set as the benchmark. So before, sort of the best currency in the world was the British pound. This is another representation of how the US is becoming one of the world's superpowers and sort of overtaking the United Kingdom for its influence around the world, because our money is now considered sort of more reputable than the British pound. Already talked about loans being given through these institutions. Alright, so this was a lot of cooperation, but remember that we are entering into this long sort of stalemate with the Soviet Union over world influence, and that's the Cold War, the idea of not so much a hot war with lots of battles and lots of sort of actual physical interaction and weapons being used, but more the idea of behind-the-scenes diplomacy trying to vie for influence and power. What we're dealing with especially, and this ties back into what I just talked about, was what is to be done in Europe with war-devastated Europe. Okay? We had to decide, is the United States going to dedicate a lot of monetary resources to help them build back up? because there was a fear that those countries could go communist, just in the same way that after World War I, many European countries gravitated towards fascism and totalitarianism because they were reeling from war, they were not recovering very quickly, and they said, well, anything's got to be better, and I guess democracy doesn't work. So what we did is we gave a lot of money and goods to European nations to help develop capitalism and democracy and convince nations that if they partnered with us, we will help you. And communism is not the answer, is what we were trying to say. In the end, we spent $12 billion given to various countries. The one that got the most aid was Germany, West Germany, because we did not want Germany to fall to communism, because it represented a border with what was becoming this Iron Curtain between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. A lot of it goes to France and Greece, who was having a communist revolution as well. Italy, countries we were concerned in Western Europe that they could not fall to communism because it would be bad for us. Okay? Now, a good representation of the Marshall Plan is kind of this next step. We were putting all this money into Europe, and eventually Stalin and the Soviet Union start to say, wow, I wonder who these countries are going to favor, who is helping them? The United States was helping them. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was taking away their industry and all their machinery back to the Soviet Union. So eventually what happens when Stalin sees that our influence is higher in the capital of Germany, Berlin, he decides to block off all the roads going into Berlin. Now, remember, Germany was divided into 4 sections of Allied occupation after World War II. Berlin was solidly within the Soviet region. So he was able to do that because he had economic or political control, but we had control of part of Berlin, and we were concerned, gosh, if he's blocking off the capital, they are going to have to favor communism in order to survive and show Stalin they're willing to work with him rather than us. So our government was in this tricky place. It was saying, do we let it fall to communism and the Soviet Union, or do we do something else? We did something else. So we flew supplies in by plane over the roads and dropped stuff into Berlin for a few months in order to keep them supplied and favoring us. Eventually Stalin backs off, but it's setting up this increasing opposition between the Soviet Union and the United States for political and economic influence in Europe as it's sort of rebuilding after the war. So this is settled peacefully, but it sets the stage for future problems in the Cold War. Other things we do now that it's clear that the Soviet Union and we, the United States, are not allies anymore, we developed something called NATO. That's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And what it was a defensive alliance with Western European nations. It involved Canada, the United Kingdom, France, West Germany, all these countries that we were allied with. Basically what it said is that if one of them were attacked by another country, we were pointing fingers at the Soviet Union without saying their name, then all the other allies were required to go to that country's defense. Now, something to bring up here. NATO is sort of the exact type of thing that the League of Nations created, a defensive alliance. And remember, the U.S. refused to join the League of Nations over this very issue. And this is representative of how we are more a world power now, that we are willing to do that, have a defensive alliance now when we weren't willing to do it back after World War I. Okay? In response, the Soviet Union creates the Warsaw Pact, which is basically NATO for European countries. So we've got these alliances formed, and in the ensuing years, weapons buildup begins in the US and the Soviet Union. Okay? Initially, these are just standard weapons. The Soviet Union is going to get nuclear capabilities within the late 1940s, early 1950s, and we're going to be sort of launched into a nuclear arms race that we're not quite ready to discuss yet. All right, next up, what we have is dealing with Asia and the potential spread of communism that could happen there. Okay, the policy that our government was taking toward communism is called the Containment Policy. Now, notice it's in red. It's a really important term to know. So the president now is Harry S. Truman. He replaced FDR after FDR died in office toward the end of World War II. Okay, now he's worried about the spread of communism at first in Europe. Okay. The USSR is trying to get more access to the Mediterranean Sea. They have control behind the Iron Curtain in Eastern Europe, and there's a civil war in Greece that it was looking like it could become a communist country, and because Greece is right sort of between the Mediterranean Sea and the Black Sea, that's going to cause economic problems even more so. So that's why we had the Marshall Plan to help sort of fight on the side of anti-communism, but Truman still needs a policy. And what his policy is going to be is the Truman Doctrine. Okay, but basically it's containment. It's saying keep communism where it is by providing monetary and military support to democratic and capitalist countries that are fighting against communism around the world. So basically we're saying we'll do whatever it takes to provide money and services and goods to countries that are having problems with communism potentially spreading and taking over their countries. Right? So this is something that could fall under the Truman Doctrine is the Marshall Plan, but we've already talked about that a little bit. What we're going to focus on containment next, though, is in Asia specifically. Now, this is a little bit of context right here of in the late 1940s, China fell to communism, okay, through the leadership of Mao Zedong. The nationalists that we supported in their efforts, that we were allies with in World War II, that's why China gets to be on the Security Council of the United Nations, falls to communism, and Truman is blamed for it. People say, mostly kind of unfounded, that he was so focused on preventing communism from spreading in Europe and helping Europe that he forgot as to what the sort of political playing field was like with communism in Asia. So now the Soviet Union has an ally with communist China, and it looks like communism is spreading, hence why there was a containment policy. But what this means is that when Truman and future presidents look at their policy in Asia regarding communism, it's going to be much more stricter about doing whatever it takes to make sure that communism does not succeed. And this happened within the next couple of years in a conflict in Korea, right? The Korean War. So after World War II, Korea had been liberated from Japan. It was taken over when they were forming their Pacific Empire. But because the Soviet Union did have a border with Korea, we have to negotiate with them as to what's going to happen there. Okay, because there was a push for communism within Korea, and what happens is it's split down the middle at the 38th parallel, line of attitude. The Soviet Union gets basically influence and power in the north, and we get influence and power in the south. So we know to this day North Korea and South Korea are still divided. This is where this whole conflict starts in the Cold War. Now, what happened that resulted in a war was that the communist North invaded the democratic capitalist South that we were supporting. They're doing so because they were trying to make all of Korea communist. They were doing so with Soviet weapons and support from them. And we're concerned, of course, about we can't have another Asian country fall to communism, because that would violate our containment policy and support something called the domino theory that we're not quite talking about here. Just the idea that if one country falls to communism, all those in their region are going to fall as well. So we didn't go in right away on our own. We went to the United Nations, which we helped to form, and we basically got their approval to represent the UN with our troops to force the North back into North Korea. So initially when we went there, it was not about fighting the communists and defeating them. It was about reestablishing the internationally agreed 38th parallel that the North was violating. But what happens is once we actually did that, we said, you know what, if we really wanted to contain communism, let's just defeat the North and make it all democratic instead. It's at that point that China sends its troops, and the Soviet Union as well, to fight back, and we get a proxy war. A proxy war is a war that's not between the main powers, but fought somewhere else with their kind of proxies, with their representatives. Okay, so this was about communism versus capitalism and democracy, but playing out in Korea instead of playing out in the Soviet Union or in the United States. Okay? Now, eventually the war, it plods on for several years, I think 3, 4, or 5, but the 38th parallel is reestablished, and to this day, it still divides these two countries in half. Now, one thing to know is that there was a general from World War II involved in Korea that was leading the troops there, and he was very popular with the public because of his kind of hero role from World War II, and he advocated publicly the use of atomic bombs on China for getting involved. Okay, remember, at this time period, we had the atomic bomb. We were the only country to have used it, but the Soviet Union now has the bomb too. So basically, he says this publicly, and Truman said, "What the hell are you saying? We're not trying to do that again." Truman didn't want to do that again, so he fired this general. And it was a huge sort of political scandal. People were all mad at Truman. It eventually all sort of blew over and was not a big deal. But it represented that we were early in the Cold War, and we didn't quite understand fully what the political playing field was like in our fight against communism. Now, a big takeaway about the Korean War. This war was not approved by Congress. Okay? To this very day, the last war to be declared by Congress was World War II. It is Korea that starts this trend of the United States going into countries with congressional approval, but with no declaration of war. Now, we're going to talk about how this sort of evolves over on. We just call it a conflict instead of a war, but basically it operated as a war. Another thing about the Korean War is that Truman desegregated the military before it happened, so it is the first military engagement that has integrated troops. You can see a picture on the right of men fighting in Korea that are black and white. They fought together instead of separately. Now, there is another thing going on in Asia, that is Vietnam. Okay? Vietnam is much like Korea in that it is going under this sort of communist conflict. It starts differently. Initially, it starts as a pushback against colonialism. So the French, somehow after World War II, still had colonial control of what they called Indochina, but what was Vietnam. There was a budding independence movement led by Ho Chi Minh, who was a communist, and there's a lot of support among the people like that. So initially, when we get involved in Vietnam, what it was about was assisting the French in sort of repressing and suppressing this independence movement because the independence movement was communist. Notice, we're doing anything to defeat communism, even if at the same time it's about autonomy. Later on, the French retreat. Vietnam is divided into North and South, just like Korea, and we then support the South Korean government to contain communism against the North. But here's the thing. It's going to be a representation of something we talk about a little later, of how we were so focused on trying to contain communism that we turned a blind eye to the fact that we were often supporting dictators, because the South Vietnamese government was so corrupt, but we only supported them because they weren't communist. We're going to talk a bit more about Vietnam and the war on the next slide. Okay, so this is a very broad one. It's talking about the Cold War as a whole, all the way from the late 40s into the 1970s. But the point that it's trying to bring across is that it wasn't just like there was one Cold War policy and we followed it the whole time. It kind of went in eras. Eras where there was direct military conflict, often proxy wars, and then also eras of mutual coexistence, or what we call détente. It's a French word for mutual coexistence. Okay? Now, we're going to talk about what this looked like, especially with Vietnam. So we're kind of talking about military conflicts first. Then we'll talk about détente, which was something that kind of came about as the Vietnam War was ending. So, the Vietnam War happened initially with President Eisenhower, the president after Harry Truman, but no president in the history of this war was willing to take the loss. Okay? Because a loss in the Vietnam War would mean a victory for communism, and we couldn't let it happen. So what we see is we've got President Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, and all these presidents refused to really just end the war, even though it became increasingly unpopular. And even during Kennedy's presidency, he said privately that there is no way we can win this war, but he wanted to get reelected. Johnson saying there's no way we can have any sort of victory here, but he wanted to get reelected. So what happened is a lot of these politicians, they get so focused on their own issues at home, as well as this Cold War mentality of being against communism at any cost, that we get engaged in a multi-decade, very costly, both in terms of money and people, war that really to this day is looked at as this failure of Cold War policy, that it didn't work out, and it's really difficult for our nation to sort of come to terms with how can we recognize the war's failures without dishonoring the sort of really the young men that were forced to fight in this war, oftentimes against their own desires. Now, we'll talk about how that affects society later on. We're just talking about the war itself for now. Now, the major, oops, I should have had that up there earlier. I'm sorry. The major thing that escalated our role in Vietnam was called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Now, I want you to think as I explain the story of how it should sound really, really familiar with at least two different things. So, what happened is we had our Navy over there off the coast of Vietnam, and we got some intelligence, some data that said that an American ship had been sunk in neutral waters by North Vietnam. Now, when LBJ went to ask his Secretary of Defense, like, show me the report, show me the data, he's like, well, we're not sure if it happened. But we could use it as an excuse to ask Congress to grant the president more power to fight this war. So, think for a second, what does this seem like? Hopefully you were thinking of the Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War, basically using this kind of shady means for escalating involvement to support our own military goals. Okay, so no ship was ever sunk in the Gulf of Tonkin with this incident, but it was used to basically give the president the power to take wartime measures that he felt were necessary without congressional approval. So what this is saying, and it's a very slippery slope, is that the president does not have to go through Congress to declare war in Vietnam. And what that means is we can officially not call it a war, but wage it as if we were waging a war. Okay? So, LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, was the one who drastically increased our involvement there. He becomes president after Kennedy gets assassinated, spoiler alert, in 1963. He serves until 1969. Okay? And that's really the time period where the bulk of the war and those serving in it were fighting. Alright, so we have an increased presence there, and we're bombing North Vietnam extensively. This was called Operation Rolling Thunder, but despite all these efforts, the war kept on going without any real progress. Okay? Now, something to sort of know about this is that we were fighting against the North Vietnamese who had a cause. They had communism, they had independence, and they were fully behind the movement. Meanwhile, the South Vietnamese were not too willing to fight the war. They wanted us to do it for them. And then we fighting the war didn't really have a cause except for ending communism. So we basically had sort of no, what's the word? We didn't really have like this investment and engagement and buy-in to it, but the North did, and that's one reason it was so hard to fight them. Okay, now LBJ himself was very conflicted about the war. He was we'll talk about him later, but he was basically a very I mean, all presidents are pretty egotistical, but he was very concerned about what his legacy would be. We're going to talk about later about his fight for civil rights, his fight in a war against poverty, but he said, I have to fight this war in Vietnam at the same time, and it's the only thing I'm going to be remembered for. It's a picture of him on the bottom right, pretty much devastated and overwhelmed by having to make these decisions when that's not what he wanted to do as president, what was sort of put into this position where he had to. And it gets so bad for him that ultimately in 1968, he chooses not to run for re-election even though he could, because he didn't want to be the one to struggle with having to be the commander-in-chief and fighting this war anymore. Okay? The war basically kind of killed him in a way. He only lives a few years after his presidency due to very poor health and just kind of, he was depressed about the whole thing. Okay? Now, who gets elected in 1968 instead? Richard Nixon. So Nixon had served as a previous president's vice president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and he gets elected, and what he proposed during his election campaign was bringing what he called peace with honor in the war in Vietnam. Now, that's kind of a euphemism for what he's trying to say is, I'm going to end the war, but we're not just going to leave overnight. And his idea for that was called Vietnamization. And what that meant is he looked at kind of how the escalation of the number of troops had risen over the time. They were basically at a pinnacle at this zenith when he came in, and he said, I'm going to follow that same path for withdrawing troops over the same amount of time and make the South Vietnamese people fight their own war instead. Okay? Now, what we basically know about this now is it was the policy that happened. It is the policy that got us out of Vietnam, but it was also increasingly clear as we were withdrawing that the South Vietnamese were not prepared to fight the war on their own. And in fact, when the final U.S. troops leave in 1973, it's only 2 years before the whole country falls to communism under North Vietnamese control. So he certainly brought about peace with honor for us, but it did result in sort of us losing the war after we were gone as well. Now, something else that Nixon pursued in terms of foreign policy was that word détente. Now, with LBJ, with JFK, with Eisenhower, there was a lot of tension between us and the Soviet Union and with powers around the world. Nixon steps in and says things have been so tense for so long, he wanted to ease those tensions between us and the Soviet Union, between us and China, in order to bring about better relations and a bit more sense of sort of peace and stability. His idea was that, yes, we know the Soviet Union is not our ally and not our friends. China, not our ally, not our friends. We have radically different views of the world. But we're leading world powers, and we need to work with them despite our differences. So some things that come out of détente. Some limitations on nuclear weapons. Nixon also visited China several times, the first president to do so since the 1920s. He basically opens up relations with them and really changes our relationship with China as well. So this is a policy that diverged from the previous 25 years, and really Nixon should get a lot of credit for this, even though, you know, he's famous for Watergate, but if it weren't for that, he probably would have been more famous for this policy to this day. All right, so how does the Vietnam War end? Nixon withdrew our troops gradually during his presidency. The North ended up winning in 1975, and it was reunited under communist control. And so Vietnam becomes a communist country. South Vietnamese who fought and many others are sent to basically these political prisons for re-education. So yes, we lost the war, and it's really hard to reckon with. But there's a lot more to talk about here about how it affected society. We're holding off on that for another slideshow for now because we're just talking about foreign policy for the moment. All right, so another element of our new approach to foreign policy in the Cold War had to do with the fact that World War II spelled the end of colonialism. Now, there was the thought that World War I might have done it, but it did not, okay, because it opened it up sort of independence movements and nationalism in Europe, so basically white countries, but not for imperialism and colonialism in general. World War II does, however. So we're going to see throughout this time period, and you can see in that map there, the areas in red are former colonial holdings that become independent within the time period where we are. Okay? So, let's look at some of those that happened that relate to us. Filipino independence in 1946. So remember, we had a very complicated relationship with the Philippines from basically, you know, winning it in the Spanish-American War, trying to force them to become a part of the United States. That didn't work out, so we kind of gave them semi-autonomy, but under our control. After World War II, they get their independence. Indian Gandhi, you should have studied this in world history, and also Algeria gets its independence from France. So we see colonialism crumbling around the world. But here's how this relates to the Cold War. There was a fear that with all these newly independent nations, what if they favor communism? What happens if, yes, colonialism is bad and it's gone, but what if it's replaced with a new foe that we are so ardently against? And a few examples of that, and how we use both diplomacy, but more often covert military operations to prevent communism from spreading, are Iran, Guatemala, Cuba, and Vietnam. I've already talked about Vietnam, now I'm going to talk about Iran. Okay, so what was going on in Iran is Iran used to be more or less controlled, or at least allied in a way, with the United Kingdom. But the end of World War II brought them independence and a lot more nationalism. People in Iran feeling we should be our own country. In the process of this, they had gotten rid of their dictator, the Shah of Iran, that used to be a Western ally, and they had democratically elected a new prime minister who said that, well, our main natural resource is oil, which is majorly important in industrial countries. Let's nationalize the oil fields now. Nationalize means making a natural resource belong to the government, and the government sells it and buys it and uses the profits to provide services through there. It's a key element of socialism, by the way. So we had economic interest there. Basically, the United Kingdom said, hey, Iran's going to take away all our oil fields, and they kicked us out diplomatically, but you're still there. Can you help us overthrow the government so we can get our way? And we said, sure, that's in our interest too. So the U.S. started using this when the CIA comes about. We overthrow the democratically elected leader of Iran and replace him with the repressive Shah, who had just been recently overthrown by the Iranian people before. So we basically installed a dictator that was going to support our policies, but we did so because we did not want things like socialism and communism to spread. This is part of a major trend in U.S. history where we think about our short-term needs and not the long-term issues. We're going to see that Iran has another revolution in the 1970s and into the 1980s that leads to us having a horrible relationship with Iran to this very day. It's not because we people in Iran and us in America hate each other. It's because our government did things there that the government and the people resent to this very day. We took away their democracy and gave them an authoritarian leader. Okay, and that's why they don't like us in many ways. Okay, there's more to this story too. I'm happy to talk about it more in class. Okay, now a brief definition, and this relates to colonialism and the Cold War. You might have heard these terms before about talking about the first and the third world. You hear things today like, oh, first world problems or third world countries. This term actually comes out of the Cold War, and we use it very differently now. What it actually meant back then, the first world were countries aligned to the United States and aligned to capitalist and democratic values. The second world were countries aligned to communism and to the Soviet Union, and the third world were countries too poor to be valued or aligned to either side. Now, the third world are often going to be these countries that used to be colonized and are now independent. So that's how it kind of fits into this, but I think it's a really sort of interesting thing to actually know what these terms mean. So today when we talk about the first and the third world, people say, well, what about the second world? Second world's gone because the Soviet Union is gone. And when I found this out, I thought it was absolutely fascinating, so I thought I shared with you. All right, so next up we want to talk about the same idea of kind of what had happened in Iran, but how it's happening in Latin America as well. So, remember we have the Containment Policy. Any country that seems like it might favor socialism or communist was a threat to our kind of world dominion. So what that means is we're willing to take sort of an interventionist policy in those places. I'm going to talk about Guatemala now, which you really should listen to this and think about how it's pretty similar to what we had done in Iran in the Middle East. So, what happened is Guatemala had a newly democratic leader. There he is on the right. I think his last name was Arbenz. And so, what he said is he looked around his country and said, wow, over half the land in my country, it's worked by my people, but owned by an American company, the United Fruit Company. So what he said is, I'm going to seize the land from them and pay them a fair price for it and use our own country and our own land for our own people instead of favoring American companies instead. So what happened is that American company, the United Fruit Company, so you probably know them as like Chiquita Banana today, that's their main brand, they asked the U.S. government through the CIA to stage a coup d'etat and basically replace this democratically elected leader who was going to try and take their land with a dictator that would favor U.S. companies and let them keep their land. So it's extremely frustrating, and it really maddens me because what we did in the process is we said, this new guy, he's a communist, he's favoring communism, and we put all sorts of propaganda out there so people in America would think that we were doing this for valid reasons of trying to overthrow and prevent the spread of communism. But what we were in fact doing is favoring business interests and basically putting in an anti-democratic, brutal dictator instead. This dictator rules for many years and is eventually killed by his own people, but another dictator is put in his place, leaving Guatemala to be basically a horrible example of human rights all throughout the 20th century, partially because we took away their democratically elected government that was going to favor its own people instead of its own interests. Okay? Shows that we wanted to help corporations at the expense of foreign democracy. And if you look to the left, the College Board has a beautiful euphemism going on here. It said that we supported non-communist regimes that had varying levels of commitment to democracy. Basically, we were supporting our own interests at the expense of democracy. And it's really maddening because, we talk about American identity all the time. Democracy and people being involved is part of the core of our country, but we didn't think it should also be part of the core of other people's country if it interfered with our interests. Okay, now, Guatemala sets the stage that, hey, this works. Iran, hey, this works. Let's continue this policy whenever we see this pop up. And it was popping up somewhere else in Latin America, specifically in Cuba. This is in the late 1950s. So we see a communist revolution developing there. Remember, we have a complicated relationship with Cuba as well, owing to the fact of the Spanish-American War. Remember, we said they got to be independent. We had that, the Teller Amendment that said we would support them having self-rule, and then we changed it to the Platt Amendment that said if the outcomes of elections seem not to favor our interests, we will interfere. And what that led to is Cuba having a series of dictators that favored U.S. economic policy into the 1950s. Eventually, the people got pretty angry, and they favored communism with their leader Fidel Castro being the leader of this revolution. So what happened is just kind of like with Arbenz, just like in Guatemala, just like we saw going on in Iran as well, our government through the CIA says, well, let's kind of make this, let's basically plan this coup and make it look like it was them overthrowing their own government instead of us being involved. I think I didn't say that in Iran and Guatemala. We used propaganda to make it look like it was the Iranians supporting their overthrow and the Guatemalans overthrowing the government on their own. And we used propaganda strategically to make that happen. So we're trying to make that happen in Cuba as well. So we planned an invasion. We had a bunch of Cuban refugees in America, training them and trying to send them back to basically make it look like they were having a revolution, Cubans overthrowing Castro. What happened, though, it was a huge failure and a public failure. So Cuba was ready to fight back, and it became increasingly clear that not only was this coup planned, but it was planned by us. And what that meant is it galvanized Castro against the United States. Yes, he was communist, but he wasn't entirely anti-American at first. Even when he was a young man, he learned English and he wrote a letter to FDR saying how much he admired him as a leader for what he was doing for the country. Now Castro's saying, I'm washing my hands of this place. They're my enemy. And what this leads to in the next 5 years was Castro allying Cuba as a communist country with the Soviet Union and allowing the Soviet Union to place some of its nuclear weapons ready to fire in Cuba. And this leads to a gigantic diplomatic crisis known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was only 13 days long in October of 1962, but it's the closest we ever came to World War III. Because we were going through the United Nations, because we didn't really communicate directly with the Soviet Union, trying to say, you need to get these weapons out of here. And the Soviet Union said, well, we'll take them out, but you need to withdraw your weapons in Turkey. And it wasn't public knowledge those weapons were there. So basically, we didn't want to do that, and they said, well, we're not going to remove ours unless you remove yours. Eventually, the U.S. puts a blockade around Cuba so no more ships can get in there, but Soviet ships come in. And there's this question about, if one of these ships fires on each other, we've got nuclear war on our hands. Eventually what happened, Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, decided to take the higher ground, and he had the ships turn around and dealt with it diplomatically. And what happened instead was that the Soviet Union removed the missiles from Cuba, and we eventually removed the missiles from Turkey. Now what happened is we had those missiles in Turkey to support our NATO allies, and we couldn't just take them away overnight without support of our allies. So what happened is Kennedy, the president at the time, said to Khrushchev that, okay, if you take yours away now, we'll take ours, we'll get NATO to support the removal of the weapons within the next few months. So we'll both get what we want here, but what also happened is it made it look like Kennedy was this, diplomatic mastermind, when really it was Khrushchev that was willing to sort of take a hit for the team in the process. All right? So, I know that was a bit of a doozy there. It dealt with a lot of things going from the late 40s into the early 1960s with Cold War policy, lots of new terms, lots of wars involved, but lots of important stuff as well. You know your next steps. You have some cards to make. Remember, I want you to use preferably red terms that relate specifically to this time period, but if there's only red terms that are referencing older stuff, choose a yellow term instead. I'd rather have a relevant yellow term than some red term just because. Do your quiz, do it 8 a.m., work on your geography, study your chronology, and you can always watch the next video if you're ready. Alright, this is Mr. Chodola signing off. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in class. Bye.